Thanks, Aaron. That was great. I love some of the verses in that last song about how he moves us into action and we must go. And that is really what Mark is writing all about as we get back into this in chapter two. Y'all can go ahead and start getting there. Um, over and over and over again, Mark shows us that he is telling us the stories of the people that see Jesus and how every time you interact with Jesus, it causes you to have to respond, that it is confrontational and it's powerful, and you have to make a response. And we're going to be looking at some of those interactions and some of those responses today. Just to remind you, Mark and Peter were writing this gospel together, and they end up focusing in this first part about the crowd and the people and those interactions and those responses. And then it ends up zooming in to also see the disciples specifically, the people who are following him and their responses to Jesus and who he is and who he says he is. And then it zooms in even more to Jesus and how he ends up showing us exactly who he is and what kind of king is going to be. And we start off this story in Mark 2 with some really desperate people. And I've been desperate before in my life, but there was one moment where um, I'm picking a lock to get into a state building because I am so desperate and I don't even realize how damaging this could be to my life. Because it started in freshman year of college. I was taking the beginning engineering classes, and one of the first classes, I hadn't yet learned how damaging procrastination can be. And we got this assignment where we had to build wooden bridges, and they had to attach to a point here and a point there, and it would be loaded from the top. And there were two ways to win this assignment. One was to build the strongest bridge out of these wooden blocks and these wooden rods. And then, if you, for some reason, couldn't build the strongest bridge, you could also win by predicting the most accurately at what pressure or at what load that bridge was going to break. And it was literally the day of, and we hadn't even started. And we're scrambling. We got the engineering building had lots of supplies. We grabbed a bunch and started heading to do this assignment. And this is getting close to midnight, and we don't have enough supplies. And we're scrambling to do the calculations to see if we can redo this, to build this bridge in a way that it we can still do the calculations and everything, and it's just not going to work. And so at like 11:30, we're scrambling, we're running to the hardware store uh, that was miraculously still open. They're out, and every other freshman engineer had already picked up all the extra supplies. And so the only other option other than getting a zero on this test is to try to get into the engineering building, because they had plenty of supplies. And if we had just been prepared, it would have been all right. So we run over to the engineering building and we're banging on doors. We're looking through the windows. There's nobody there. It's a ghost town. And that's when I decide I'm going to try to pick the lock. And I have my teammates and they're on lookout, and I start picking the lock. And I'm so desperate, I'm not even realizing that if we get caught doing this, breaking into a state-owned building, I mean, I could get suspended, I could get expelled, I could have charges brought against me. But I hear the click, and we're in, and we're running through the building. We're able to get into the specific room that we need to, which was another whole hurdle. And we run back, and we're trying to put this together in time so that the glue can dry. And only afterwards did we start talking about this story and realize exactly the cost that could have happened for being that desperate. And when you think about that moment, when I think about that moment of desperation, it was such this eager panic. of wanting the hope of not being the only team that literally didn't have something to bring to the room, and to get a grade and not a zero. I can only think about Mark 2 being even more of a desperate situation. So I'm going to go ahead and start reading. When he entered Capernaum again after some days, it was reported that Jesus, was at home. So many people gathered together that there was no more room, not even in the doorway, and he was speaking the message to them. Then they came to him, bringing a paralytic carried by four men. Since they were not able to bring him to Jesus because of the crowd, they removed the roof above where he was, and when they had broken through, they lowered the mat on which the paralytic was lying. Seeing their faith, Jesus told the paralytic, "Son, your sins are forgiven." But some of the scribes were sitting there, thinking to themselves, "Why does he speak like this? He's blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone?" Right away, Jesus understood in his spirit that they were thinking like this within themselves and said to them, "Why are you thinking these things in your hearts? Which is easier to say to the paralytic, 'Your sins are forgiven,' or to say, 'Get up, pick up your mat, and walk?' But so you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins," he told the paralytic, "I tell you, get up, pick up your mat, and go home." Immediately he got up, picked up the mat, and went out in front of everyone. As a result, they were all astounded, and they gave glory to God, saying, "We have never seen anything like this." God, we just ask that you be here with us, that you send your spirit. We just ask that you spit on the eyes of our hearts right now and wipe the scales off of the eyes of our hearts so that we may see you. We ask that your living word be loud and clear today, and that take these sometimes very, very familiar stories, and that you show up so that we can see you today. And so it's a complicated scene here, okay? Jesus gets ambushed. They find out that, they've already know about Jesus and what he's already done, that we've talked about in chapter 1, and people are desperate to see him. And so I can imagine this happening, Jesus showing up, someone, coming on in, then somebody else, and then somebody else, and they start pressing in tighter and tighter, trying to, get their ears a little bit closer until the point where there's literally just not even standing room only, but there's nowhere to squeeze in anymore. And the pressure of shoulders, squeezing beside each other. And then the the paralytic and his friends come. And I can't imagine, like, the the conflict there. Like, was the paralytic, did he even know yet? Did his friends just run there to grab him and get him to Jesus as soon as possible? But even in that timing, they're there too late. And I can just see it. I'm at the doorway, and they're like, "Hey, let us in, let us in." And the person at the doorway is like, "No, there's too many people, and I kind of want to hear this too." And having the desperation to not give up at that moment, but to literally start climbing up to the roof and doing destruction to somebody's property. We actually just a couple weeks ago had somebody up on our roof trying to see if we needed a new roof, and this jerk didn't have a good attitude, and to make his point, literally grabs a shingle and just rips it off of the roof. And I'm like, as a homeowner, I'm like, "Don't do that. You can't just do that. That's a terrible thing to do." And I can only imagine, with the complexity of Jesus preaching and these guys so desperate to get their friend or family member in to see Jesus, they start ripping holes into the construction of this roof. It's this is a real effort here, and yet Jesus keeps preaching, and there's probably debris falling down on the people. I can imagine the homeowners, like, what is he going to do? Is he like trying to do that whisper yell of like, "Stop, stop, leave it alone"? Or is he scrambling, trying to get out of a window so he can try to slow these guys down? But they won't be turned away. They are too desperate. And then they finally lower him down. And I think Jesus' response is so curious. They lower him down, and he sees Jesus, and Jesus sees his heart, and he does a miracle. But he's not addressing his infirmity. He's addressing his sins. And not having an infirmity myself, I'm only going off a secondhand, but It is not easy to be paralyzed. I mean, you're talking about not being able to go to the bathroom by yourself, not being able to get, and the weight of all of that is oppressive. Not only that, but in these times specifically, if you had an infirmity like this, everybody assumed that you had either done something really terrible or maybe your parents had done something really terrible and your sins were the fault. And I can't imagine a lifetime worth of gossip and slurs and insults and assumptions about your sin. And they lower him in. And maybe that was what that paralytic needed even more than being healed, was to know that he was loved and that he was forgiven. And yet, that caused a response in everybody else. Just like when anytime that you see Jesus, it demands a response. And the scribes were right. Nobody but God can can say that they forgive sins. But they focused so much on that that they missed the fact that God was with them in that moment. And Jesus heard their thoughts, another miracle, and he addresses it. And he just calls they're trying to call his bluff, and he just throws down his cards and ante's up, and he's like, which is easier, to say something about forgiving sins that you don't have visibility into the spiritual world, or to say something, get up and walk? And he does that so that they will know that he is the Son of Man. And even that is not in line with their dynamic. So, next scene in verse 13. Then Jesus went out again beside the sea. The whole crowd was coming to him, and he taught them. Then, moving on, he saw Levi, or Matthew, the son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax office, and said to him, "Follow me." So he got up and followed him. He saw Jesus, he engaged with him and interacted with him, and it demanded a response. And he immediately got up. Now, we've talked about the tax collectors before, how they were terrible and they had no more belonging. They gave up their belonging for wealth. It would be somewhat equivalent to a Jew in Nazi Germany getting a big paycheck to work for the Nazis to rat out other Jews. It's just a complete betrayal of community, but it came with really significant financial rewards. Um, and he's sitting in his office and starts to follow him. And then in verse 15, while Jesus was reclining at the table in Levi's house, many tax collectors and sinners were also guests with Jesus and his disciples, because there were many who were following him. When the scribes of the Pharisees saw that he was eating with sinners and tax collectors, they asked his disciples, "Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners?" When Jesus heard this, he told them, "Those who are well don't need a doctor, but the sick do need one. I didn't come to call the righteous, but to call sinners." And yet again, this is another time where the paradigm of the people currently is not meshing with the paradigm of Jesus and his new kingdom that he's going to establish. And especially because if this guy is the Messiah that they expect, the Messiah that they're expecting is one of power and privilege and authority. And that is very antithetical to the fact that he's sitting with the untouchables of their times, the tax collectors and the sinners. And it calls us to remind ourselves that our culture has their untouchables, and they're probably not tax collectors anymore. I have an aunt who's works for the IRS. You know, Chalobi, he's kind of a tax collector in his own way, and that we don't have any problem with that. We have our own untouchables, and it could be felons. It could be the LGBTQ community. These people that whatever for whatever reason our society has demonized as the sick among us, and yet those are the community that Jesus wants to pursue, to be the doctor for. And they are the community that we should be called to chase after as well. So the dynamic is not fitting, and it continues in verse 18. Now John's disciples, John the Baptizer's disciples, and the Pharisees were fasting. People came and asked him, "Why do John's disciples and the Pharisees' disciples fast, but your disciples do not fast?" Jesus said to them, "The wedding guests cannot fast while the groom is with them, can they? As long as they have the groom with them, they cannot fast. But the time will come when the groom is taken away from them, and then they will fast in that day. No one sews a patch of unshrunk cloth onto an old garment. Otherwise, the new patch pulls away from the cloth and a worse tear is made. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins. Otherwise, the wine will burst the skins and the wine is lost as well as the skins. But the new wine is for fresh wineskins." So, it was common during those times to have regular days of fasting. And the Pharisees observed this, John's disciples were observing this, and it was really obvious that Jesus and his disciples were not doing that. And he's saying, "Hey, listen, the party is now, and I am here. And so we are going to be celebrating in this. When I go, there will be time for fasting, but now is not that time." And then he uses these two analogies that I love, and we can relate to them a little bit, but I'll be a little bit more clear. I don't know about y'all, but who's ever had a shirt that you bought that great in the store, really, jamming, just felt like your jam. You bring it home, you wash it, you put it back on, and it doesn't fit anymore. And it's just such a frustrating experience, right? That is exactly the reference, because it was even more of an issue back in those times with their materials that they had. And so if you had a patch and you were trying to mend it with a brand new piece of material, and then you sewed it all, stitch it all together nice and tight, and then wash it, it shrinks so bad, it actually pulls the fabric apart even worse, for what you did. And that's what he's saying. He's saying, "Don't you dare use me as a patch into your system. Don't you dare use me as a patch into your dynamic to fill in some gap for you. I am not going to be that for you. That is not going to work with your system." And then to similarly show a different point, he uses this wine analogy. I have this vivid memory of cleaning out my car when my kids were younger, and I found a sippy cup that had some apple juice in it, and I had no idea how long it had been there in the summer heat. I mean, and so I I knew I had to dump this out and wash it out, and when I opened it, I heard that of it having some carbonation, right? Because it had been fermenting itself. There was some apple juice wine that I was not going to try. And sure enough, I opened it and it had that smell of that alcohol fermentation process going to some degree. And that is the process that he's talking about here. Because when they would make wine, they would pour the grape juice into these wine skins, these sheepskins or these animal skins, because they had to have some flexibility like skin does. And as the carbonation would increase, so would the wine skins, and they would be able to hold it. Now, the problem with old wine skins is it loses some of that flexibility. And if you keep trying to use skins after they're too old, then they burst and it wastes all the wine. And now you don't have, your bottle anymore to keep anything in. And that's what he's saying. He's saying, "Listen, I am a new wine, and your vessel cannot hold this. It's not enough. You need something new to be able to hold me, and you can't use part of this newness to fix your old system." And we're about to see this as the story continues to amp up. So, as we continue, we're going to go in verse 23. On the Sabbath, he was going through the grain fields. They were walking through the grain fields, and his disciples began to make their way, picking some heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And he said to them, "Have you never read what David and those who were with him did when he was in need and hungry? How he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar, the high priest, and ate the sacred bread, which is not lawful for anyone to eat except the priests, and also gave some to his companions?" Then Jesus told them, "The Sabbath was made for a man, not man for the Sabbath. Therefore, the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." And so he's setting everything clear here. Because in those times, if you were walking through a field on any given day and you were hungry, it was accepted as a generous kind of obligation, social obligation, to allow people to be able to pop off a couple pieces of grain and eat them as a snack. Or if you were walking through a vineyard, you could pop off a couple grapes and as a snack. Now you can't, it would be illegal to harvest them, but when he's saying they're breaking the law, it's not like a theft law. They're talking about the law that they added to God's law, where God said, keep the Sabbath day holy. And then they started drilling down to what they thought that meant. Okay, well, if it's Sabbath day holy, well, you can't go to work. Check. Well, you also can't like go on a long trip, so what's a long trip? And they started counting how many steps you could make, and they started saying, well, if you make your food, I mean, that's working. You got to do work, and then you got to clean the dishes, so you can't make food. It's already got to be prepared food. And then, well, you can't go get food either. And so that's what they're getting here is they've added so many laws around the laws to make sure that you don't ever get anywhere close to the actual law. And to the point that they're literally just grabbing a snack on their walk, and that doesn't fit in their dynamic. And so Jesus sets them straight, and they say, hey, this guy that you love, David, don't you remember he broke some laws? And the Sabbath is a blessing for people. The Sabbath is a blessing to us today if we observe it. It is not an obligation that we're held to. And Jesus here is starting to crank up the volume a little bit more, and he's saying the Son of Man is the Lord even of the Sabbath. And he is starting to set the stage for his authority even higher, to the point that they're immediately going to try to test him. So in the first part of chapter 3, now Jesus entered the synagogue again, and a man was there who had a paralyzed hand. In order to accuse him, they were watching him closely to see whether he would heal him on the Sabbath, which would definitely be work. He told the man with the paralyzed hand, stand before us. Then he said to them, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do what is good or to do what is evil, to save life or to kill? But they were silent. After looking around at them with anger and sorrow at the hardness of their hearts, he told the man, stretch out your hand. So he stretched it out, and his hand was restored. Immediately the Pharisees went out and started plotting with the Herodians against him, how they might destroy him. I mean, how solidified, how chained do you have to be to the false god of your current beliefs in religion that you see miracles like this and you start plotting against to kill Jesus? Um, I love the part where it talks about how they were silent, and after looking around at them with anger and sorrow in their hearts, he began to tell the man, I can empathize with that, where you go into your church, you're going to the synagogue, and these are the people that you want to build into, that you want on your, to bring into your kingdom. And when you ask a very simple question, which is, what does it say? Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do what is good or evil, to save life or kill? And he's saying, which is a simple question, right? And everybody knows the right answer to that question. But these guys remain completely silent. And they betray Jesus in this way. And they show him that he's no longer belonging with their silence, and that they are no longer going to wrestle or engage or communicate with him. And I can just imagine the anger of that, and that they would be so hard-headed, and the sorrow in that, and the loss of that. And so yet again, we see the fact that these people are experiencing the power and the person of Jesus, and everybody is having a reaction, that they're desperate people seeking after him in faith, and their sins are being forgiven, and miracles are being done. We're also seeing that the untouchables interact with Jesus, and they follow him. And the dynamic of someone who has no belonging finally having a place of belonging and in Jesus, and being sick in all the different ways that we can be sick, and yet coming to the good doctor for our healing. And then we also saw how Jesus makes it clear that he is not going to be a patch to stitch up your life. It's not enough. Jesus is too much for that. And he's not going to be poured into to fill the vessels of our systems and our schedules, but that he needs a whole new thing. And he invites us into that newness. He invites us into his healing. And some see Jesus and they reject him as king. He is trying to invade each and every one of our hearts, and he is trying to invade it with a new authority and a new power and new priorities. And some refuse to be invaded, and they reject him and even plot to kill him. So we're going to continue moving through Mark and seeing him engaging with the crowd and their reactions and with his disciples, and zooming in closer and closer to his coronation. But for now, I'm going to put in some discussion questions and we can start going into our small groups, start discussing all of this. Okay. See you all in a bit.